So this session is all about introducing new perspectives to each other and particularly to the audience that we have today. And we're really interested in how do we stimulate more innovation in local government and work much more effectively with citizens and stakeholders. So, welcome to Peter, welcome to Rushka, welcome to Noel, and welcome to Beryl. Thank you for joining this conversation. I'm going to start with the first question just to kick us off. We're talking about stimulating innovation in local government. Why innovate? Why do we need to do this? In terms of the organisations that you're working with and the people that you're familiar with in your day-to-day, how well do you think they're innovating? What kind of marks would you give them out of 10 if you could, 1 being the worst and 10 being excellently brilliant? So why is innovation needed and what mark would you give them out of 10? Let's go to Rushka first. And thank you for joining us all the way from South Africa today.
Thank you so much, Louise. Very excited to be here. So I think, if I look at our context here in South Africa, innovation is critical because not only are we still battling the really complex challenges that we have been doing for many years around, housing shortages, issues of inequality, poverty, water and other environmental resource scarcity. But, on top of that, we also have these very new kind of crises that are shaping our ability to respond in the ways that we previously did, right? So we also have extreme fiscal constraints, which means that there's less public sector funding for all of these various issues. And, a number of shocks and stresses, COVID-19 being a very good example of a shock, and stresses here like continued drought and energy shortages. So all of these mean that the way that we used to do things is not only hasn't been very impactful, it's also becoming largely impossible to continue in that way. And so for me, this really is the why for innovation. And on your second question of how I would rate the organizations I work for, this is a hard one, just because my organization, we work across government at various scales of government. And so while we've seen many great examples of innovation, which I'm hoping to share later on, we've also seen many examples of people being stuck in their old ways. So I would put it at midway and a 5 at this point.
I probably shouldn't have given you such an easy scale to choose a midway, but we understand why you said that. Thanks so much, Rushka. And going back to the UK, Noel, do you tell us about why you believe innovation is needed in local government and how well you think your departments are doing?
Thanks, Louise. So firstly, I think, we can see kind of the waves of social and economic change. And we saw that even before the pandemic with different trends in how people live and work, kind of disruption from digital technology on communities, but also whole new sectors. And particularly, I think, since the pandemic in terms of new inequalities rising as well. And as a result, we also see in our local places people living next to each other who live very different lives, and organisations and sectors really having to really reinvent themselves actually to be able to survive, let alone to thrive in kind of this new economy. And I think what we've seen in the pandemic, where, you've got innovations of neighbours actually creating mutual aid groups from scratch to support each other and to support their communities and pull different resources to be able to do that. Beer manufacturers, for example, repurposing kind of their tools to create antibacterial gel to help people, or the public sector repurposing their spaces to enable communities to deliver food, has shown actually innovation is really important and actually is often more effective when kind of it really responds to like a really visible need or in the case of the pandemic, a crisis. And when there's a curiosity of people to learn from each other, that it's not, incremental improvement, but, kind of beer manufacturers will have to be learning from like the kind of the medical industry in terms of how to create antibacterial gel. Those neighbours needed to learn what were the needs of people maybe they didn't speak to in order to help them. And then, collaboration to actually bring those different tools and resources to create new innovations and to be able to adapt. So kind of an innovation is never an end of itself. The practice of innovation is often more important than the initial innovation. And innovation, I think, as a behaviour is so important now for citizens, for the public sector, for companies to be able to adapt and reinvent to these constant waves of change.
Thanks, Noel. And what about a mark out of 10?
I'm maybe going to be more optimistic than Rushka and give it a 7, I think. And that's really, I think, through seeing what our communities and businesses are doing on the ground and how we can support them more necessarily than the practice of my department per se.
Brilliant. Thank you, Noel. Peter, this is a very difficult question for you to ask. You're a British, but living in France, working all over Europe and in fact all over the world. Some of the most interesting work that we've done together on cities has been in Seoul and East Asia. And so you take this question wherever you would like. But yeah, why, from the various cities that you've worked with, do you see the need for innovation? And how generally do you think we're doing on this?
Okay, I had to switch off my mic, so I hope you can hear me, which we're not allowed to say anymore. So, first of all, why is it needed? Well, if you look back, many of our local services, and I'm talking mostly from a sort of European perspective. We do occasional visits to Southeast Asia. But from a European perspective, most services were developed in a previous age, and they're out of date. This is even the way we go to a Spanish or an Italian city, and you find that everything has to be signed by the director. And we just can't. The idea of a flat hierarchy that you would find in a more modernized Netherlands-type local administration doesn't exist so much in Southern Europe. So there is a need for sort of systemic innovation in the sense of modernizing the structures of government. And this isn't just local government, this is all levels of government. So that's the first reason why we need it. And if you think back to that, what that age was, people used to go to a public office, they'd sit in a horrible chair, they'd be smoking inside the waiting room. They'd chuck their cigarette end on the floor. There was no internet. There was no mobile phone. It was a completely different world. And that was the world I started working in Hackney Council in 1979, in January 1979. And that was what our waiting room looked like. So I'm describing a real place. In terms of my score, I would actually give a range. The cities innovate in Europe, possibly at 7 or 8, but the vast majority are at 4. Because they're not really looking at this in an organized way. So for me, innovation has to be something you do deliberately. It has to be organized. So it's not just organic or random. It's a thing you take a deliberate approach to solving a problem or improving a service. It needs to be evidence-based. You need to be measuring how things were and how things are now so that you get a sense of whether you're improving. So that's my score, between 3 or 4 for the laggards and 8, maybe even higher for some of the best cities that I've witnessed.
Thanks, Peter. From the experience I have with cities as well in Europe, I accept that. I think that's a sensible approach. Birol, you have worked with municipalities serving as sub-governor of various districts and held several senior management positions in local and national government. So from your perspective, from a Turkish perspective, why do you think innovation is needed in local government? How well do you think they are doing on the score of 1 to 10?
Öncelikle hepinize saygılar sunarak konuşmama başlamak istiyorum. Bana bu fırsatı verdiğiniz için çok teşekkür ediyorum. Yerel yönetimler dünyanın her yerinde şehirlerin ortak sorunları var ve bunların ortak çözümleri var. Bugünkü konuştuğumuz konuda da yine hepimiz biliyoruz ki dünya nüfusunun %55'i şehirlerde yaşıyor ama Türkiye'de %77.4'ü halkımızın büyük şehirlerde yaşıyor. Ve %90'ın üzerinde de %94'e yakını belediye sınırları içerisinde yaşıyor insanlarımızın. Belediyeler tabii ki halkın hayatını kolaylaştırabilmek için halka en yakın yönetim yerleri olarak dünyadaki gelişmeleri yakından takip etmek zorunda ve kıt kaynaklarını yeniliklerle birlikte halka daha iyi hizmet sunabilmek için kullanmak zorundalar. Bu amaçla yenilikleri, innovation'ı öncelik olarak mutlaka hizmetlerine eklemlemek zorundalar. Ve şunu söyleyeyim, bir defa bu Covid-19 sürecinde dünyamız yeni bir döneme girmiş durumda. Eğer şehrin sorunlarına dijital, elektronik ortamda çözüm bulamayan şehirler daha geriye kalmakta bugün itibariyle. Elin'in de söylediği gibi kıt kaynakların iyi kullanılması. Mesela bugün Türkiye'de belediyelerimiz toplu ulaşım Covid'in yayılmasının en çok önlenilmeye çalışılan alanlarından birisi. Bazı belediyelerimiz bugün itibariyle herkese bir kod vererek hastalık geçirenlerin merkezi idareyle birlikte çalışarak herkesin sağlık durumunu elektronik ortamda takip edebiliyor ve sağlık durumu uygun olmayanlar pandemiyle mücadele için toplu taşımaya alınmıyorlar. Kapalı ortamlara, insanların yoğun olarak girdikleri yerlerde veyahut da havalimanlarında, her türlü insanların birlikte bulundukları yerlerde hepimizin bir artık sağlık kodu var ve sağlık durumu uygun olmayanlar, pandemiye bulaşmış olanlar buralara alınmıyor. Bu belediyelerimizin en son uyguladıkları ve halkın sağlığını korumak için çok sıkı bir şekilde takip ettikleri bir uygulama aslında. Şimdi bizim belediyelerimiz tüm dünyada olduğu gibi birbirlerinden kapasite olarak çok farklılar. Mesela 15 milyon nüfuslu İstanbul Büyükşehir Belediye'miz var ve 750 bin nüfuslu belediyelerimiz var. En küçüğü de Ordu Büyükşehir Belediye'miz var. Bunların tabii ki innovation'ı, yeniliği, bünyelerine katma oranları birbirinden çok farklı. Burada Konya, Antalya, İstanbul, Ankara gibi büyük şehirlerimizde yeniliği kendi bünyelerine adapte etme bu belediyelerimize 10 üzerinden 8 verebiliriz ama kapasitesi daha düşük olan belediyelerimiz var. Buralarda da yine önemli çalışmalar olmasına rağmen hala buralarda yeniliği belediye hizmetlerine adapte edebilmek için çalışan belediyelerimize belki daha düşük notlar vermeliyiz. Ama hepimize şunu söyleyebilirim. Yani burada özellikle şunu söylemek istiyorum. Belediyelerimizin birçoğu dünya şehri olmak istiyor. Dünya ile yarışmak istiyor ve halka dünyanın diğer yerlerindeki en iyi hizmetleri sunabilmek için var güçleriyle yenilikleri hizmetlerine adapte etmeye çalışıyorlar.
Many thanks, Birol, for sharing this. And I think the urban-rural divide is something that others might pick up later on in the conversation. I'm going to go to each of you now. And again, thank you, Birol, for introducing some very practical examples there. I'd like to ask Noel first, actually, for some practical examples. I hope everyone can hear and there isn't too much feedback there. I'd like to ask Noel for a question on how do we stimulate more of this innovation in local government? How do we encourage more people to take this innovative approach and this innovative mindset that you talked about in your introduction? Great if you could give us some examples of some of the ways you've seen it applied and really think about what the kind of principles that others in the sector could use to apply this kind of innovation mindset to their own work. So thanks, Noel.
Thanks, Louise. So I think there are 5 principles, and I'll give 2 or 3 examples throughout. I think the first one is around mobilizing people around causes that have a visible impact on people's lives and that can be tackled at both an individual level, a community level, and also an institutional level so that everyone can see what role they can play. An example of that we're doing in Camden is around Renewal Commission. We're anchoring around 4 key missions where local and national policymakers are developing propositions around those missions, but which are really rooted in the lived experience of residents. But what we're also doing is starting to test out some of those hypotheses on the ground to create feedback. And one of those is a space called Think and Do, where we created a physical space where we want to enable people to do kind of 3 things. One, which is to be able to discover how to live more sustainably in like really practical ways, whether that's like how to do retrofitting or reuse. The second, in terms of being able to actively take part in activities that tackle the issue. So like a library of things where equipment, through to running activities themselves, like a food co-op on a housing estate, through to like a whole livable neighbourhood demonstrator where there's active changes to physical infrastructure around transport. And for us, I mean, that might sound, pop-up space might sound superficial, but actually it's both a symbolic space that's more inclusive because it's literally off the high street. And it brings both residents, but also public sector staff and staff from other companies as well to really collaborate and to be able to work at levels. And I think that links into the second principle, which is really rooting innovation in the distinctive identity of the actual place and in a way that celebrates the creativity of its local communities. Otherwise, the innovation will kind of look kind of foreign to like what's going on in that community. And that's something we've done with a campaign called We Make Camden, which celebrates the stories and activities of residents who literally make Camden what it is, whether that's young people developing a startup to help people fix smartphones from gas, or even having a poet in residence to work with our kind of families in crisis. Also, I think creating spaces which bring people from different practices, so not just public sector staff together or not just citizens together, but bringing designers and even playwrights or, like I said, poets, community organisers together, because it gets people curious about each other's perspectives because they don't know enough about how each other's sectors work to be able to make assumptions. I think the third thing is about enabling people to be able to immerse themselves in experiences that give them the confidence and context to take part in more structured activities and to provide stepping stones for people to work differently so they can take the skills developed and take them back into their teams. And I gave an example about how we're doing that with Think and Do, and that kind of incremental journey that people can take from jumping into that space to learn to then running activities. Another way we're doing that is through the Public Collaboration Lab, which is a partnership we've developed with an arts university, which brings together artists and designers with frontline staff and community organisations to tackle issues in creative ways. And that means we use skills as a council that we wouldn't normally call upon. So, for example, getting industrial designers to prototype furniture for people on very low incomes, or using storytellers to support young people to develop hubs for young people, or product designers to help better separate waste. I think the fourth thing that I've definitely learned is about inviting people to participate at points in time that will have the greatest impact on them. And often that's through transition. So for residents, that's inviting, for example, people that are on the point of leaving school, or that are retiring, or that have been made unemployed, or that have just been diagnosed with a long-term health condition. And then I think that also applies for staff. So when staff are joining an organisation, that's a really great time at which to bring them into innovation programmes and workshops. And then finally, I think helping innovation scale, but at a really human level. So I talked about the Public Collaboration Lab, partnership between a university and a council bringing design support in. And we evolved that from just working with public services to working with community organisations, with always helping residents solve problems. And then what we did in terms of scaling is actually we decided to root it in a specific neighbourhood within Camden and turned it into a physical space that we co-designed with residents from that neighbourhood, which was all around actually how to develop more skills and how to better connect people. And so as a result, we turned it into a makerspace where that helps us partner with a property developer, a library and another community organisation. And that physical space actually helped make visible the change taking place in that community, the innovations taking place both in the makerspace and throughout the neighbourhood. But it was also a platform, us within that neighbourhood, to really influence the wider regeneration that the council and the property developer were working on, and using different levers beyond funding or delivering services, which was our respective roles as landowners and as employers and as placemakers as well. And so we're now part of a European programme of projects which are space as a way of influencing master planning on big regeneration schemes. And I'd say finally, and this might seem trivial actually, but actually I find that the best ingredient to help people innovate is actually to enable them to create time and to give them time. We're often, overworked in our lives, whether that's working in a public sector or private sector, or in general. And actually it's people that are able to have the time or have the space to be able to come up with ideas, to connect with other people, that actually seems to me to be one of the kind of the most important initial conditions to enable our citizens to innovate.
Thank you, Noel, for so many practical examples of things that you're doing. And I think one of the things I love so much about your work and the way you've approached it in the council is definitely how you're bringing in other people, really looking beyond the resources that you have in the council and looking at the resources in the local community and how you can work with them. But it's also very visible, I think, to the local communities and the people that you serve, the work that you're doing in all of the projects that you described. So really appreciate you sharing that and those ways of stimulating. I'd actually like to go to Peter next as well, because I think what Noel described really talks about civil servants having a very different role and local government people playing more of a role as a facilitator or enabler that's rooted in local action in the communities around. So I wonder whether you could comment on how that role has started to change and where it's working well, and some of the practical things that people might be doing around the public sector or adopting this slightly different role as a facilitator or enabler.
Thanks, Louise. Yeah, very interesting examples from Noel. I'll use a few more just to make it concrete. But I think the first thing to think about is that public officials have tended to be hierarchic. They've tended to think that they own the solution and that the communities are really going to be told, famous Einstein's ladder of participation, where manipulation is the most common form of engagement by local public sectors rather than listening or citizen control. So, for example, Amersfoort, which is a smallish city in the Netherlands, their general manager, who's a bit like a mayor, said at the beginning of 2017 to his 300 civil servants that he wanted them to become free-range civil servants. And he wasn't meaning free-range chickens, but he was using the word to illustrate that he wanted them to get out of the office and go into the community and listen. That idea of listening, and this has been very successful, and they've done a number of major schemes, including a public park on a former hospital site, which really speaks to this as it's an activity park rather than a sweep of green land, which many other parks are. That idea of listening was something that Seoul took very seriously with the beginning of Park Won-soon's mayoralty in about 2010. He even had an artist build a symbolic ear outside the city hall, and you could record your message to the city by speaking into this ear. But he also combined this with decentralization. So for a very big municipality of 10 million people, he tried to break the city hall down and take power out into local communities. Several cities in Europe have tried to do this through participative budgeting approaches, and this speaks to what Noel called enabling, because actually this puts money into local community projects. So 3 examples I would point to would be Lisbon, which has a program, an annual edition over 10 years called BitZip, which focuses on poor neighborhoods, and roughly 72 poor neighborhoods benefit. And they get about 1.5 projects every year funded out of BitZip. They're small projects, under $50,000, but still worth having. And they give people the muscles to start working with. Berlin has been doing this for 20 years, again in poor neighborhoods. And they actually set up a local office in each of 34 poor neighborhoods of Berlin, and also fund small scale projects, but on a sliding scale, so that they have higher levels of oversight the more the budget is. And Cascais, which is in Portugal as well, quite close to Lisbon, it has a very well established participative budgeting approach. And in fact, the whole budget of Cascais is examined using that type of approach. So it's also a form of transparency. I won't go on too long, but just one other approach which I've seen cities using is to have innovation labs. One of the most famous was Mexico City, which alas has not survived the latest election, but one of our colleagues was running this very successfully. And to take one example, they used data to analyze the lack of play space in poor neighborhoods and then organize street closures and permanent play spaces within former streets as a way of compensating for the lack of green spaces for children in those particular neighborhoods. And Cluj in Romania has set up a form of urban lab, which is using an EU-funded project money to visualize the future economy of Cluj. Cluj is one of the more developed cities within Romania, about 300,000 people, but they've been trying to visualize, and at the same time, they're trying to address problems within a Roma encampment, which is so poor that the shacks are built on a waste tip. So they've been trying to address problems in that area, again, within the context of the same project. So I would point to this enabling role, a cultural shift with the officers who need to start working in a new way, which is more about listening and also perhaps learning from the program I was working with, URBAC. The need, which Noel also mentioned, the need to bring experts in touch with citizens and for what I would call stakeholder groups to be established on particular topics or for particular neighborhoods. You can either be topic-based or you can focus on particular areas. But this really helps to get deeper understanding of problems and to produce action plans which can then crack them. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Peter. Again, some more fascinating examples. I know Birol has to run for a flight quite soon, so I'm going to go to Rushka just for a brief comment and then over to Birol, and Rushka will come back to you right afterwards, if that's okay. So Rushka, I mean, one of the questions I'd like to ask you later on is about how do we convince other people to work in this way, and how do you convince people these approaches are valuable? But I'll come back to you for that question. For now, I'd love you if you could share some of the examples of how you've seen innovation in local government in South Africa in your work, just for a few minutes. Then we'll go to Birol, then we'll come back to you on convincing people. Thanks, Rushka.
Sorry. So yeah, I mean, I think that for us and in our work as the EDP, what we've been really interested in is, finding ways of new ways of addressing old issues. And so our work has largely been focused on creating those spaces within government for these things to be tested. And a key question of ours, especially when it comes to things like governance and how we view governance, which traditionally and still quite prevalent within government here today, is this idea of governance that equals compliance, that equals ticking boxes, that equals, holding people to account. And, we've been toying with this question of, well, is there a different way of thinking about governance? And is there a kind of reality in which governance isn't disabling or constraining aspect of our work, but is there a way for it actually to enable and to be a lever for systems impact and systems change? And so our work with many agencies in local government is really to explore this. And what it looks like in reality, I would say, it's the kinds of things that Peter and Noel mentioned. It's one, getting out and seeing the communities that we're planning for. And lots of the times, officials are sitting in their office, they haven't seen the school, they haven't seen the road, they haven't immersed themselves in the space that they're trying to change. And that's powerful. Creating spaces where officials feel safe to share their views, their thoughts and experiences. For us, that has been a process of innovation. And so when we think about innovation, it's beyond kind of these often technical solutions, but really new ways of coming together, new ways of organizing ourselves around problems and around our communities.
Thanks for sharing that, Rushka. Now to Birol, before you get on your plane, tell us, in the next 10 years, how do you want public servants to see themselves?
Thank you very much. Önümüzdeki 10 yıl içerisinde kamu görevlileri nasıl olacak? Gerçekten kamu görevlileri eski Mısır medeniyetinde veya Roma İmparatorluğunda veyahut da Çin medeniyetinde zorunlu kamu hizmeti olmaktan çıkıp bir defa halkın hayat kalitesini yükseltmek için sunulan hizmetler olmaya dönüşeceğine inanıyorum. Zaten 18. yüzyılda Amerika'da 300 kişiye bir kamu görevlisi düşerken bugün tüm dünyada 20 ya da 10 kişiye bir kamu görevlisi düşmekte. Ama önümüzdeki 10 yıl içerisinde eski Roma İmparatorluğu'nda her bir askerde bulunan kürek yerine her bir kamu görevlisinin elinde, benim de şu anda olduğu gibi elimde bir tablet. Bu tabletle her türlü hizmetin sunulabileceği ve tablet üzerinden bütün hizmetlerin optimal bir şekilde organize edilebileceği. Mesela İşte çöp kovaları dolduğu zaman çöplerin toplanabileceği veyahut da kamu kaynaklarının daha etkin kullanılabileceği veya hiçbirimizin toplu taşımayı geleceği saati bildiğimiz için durakta beklemek için zaman harcamayacağımız, artık bunu bugün zaten yapıyoruz, veyahut da kamu kurumuna gitmek zorunda kalmayacağımız bir kamu hizmeti sisteminin hayata geçeceğine inanıyorum. Bunları hayata geçiren şehirlerin yükseleceğini, bunları hayata geçiremeyen şehirlerin ise halklarının hayat kalitesini yükselmekte zorlanacağını ve vatandaşlarını kaybedeceğine inanıyorum. Benim gerçekten 4'te uçuşum var. Eğer izin verirseniz bunları söyleyerek ayrılmak istiyorum. Daha sonra tekrar videodan izleyeceğim. Harika konuştunuz. Herkesi tebrik ediyorum. Hepinizin ülkesini biliyorum ve harika işler yapıyorsunuz. Başarılar diliyorum. Bir de şunu söylemek istiyorum. Yerel yönetimler merkezi idareyle ne kadar yakın ve güzel çalışırsa halklarına o kadar güzel hizmetler sunuyorlar. Bunu birlikte çalışmayı başarabilmemiz gerekiyor. Bu programa beni dahil ettiğiniz için çok teşekkür ediyorum. Çok özür dileyerek ayrılmak zorundayım. Başımda bekliyorlar.
Thank you, Birol, for your time. You can slip off, and we really appreciate your contribution. And next time, hopefully, we can speak for longer. Thank you, Birol. how do we convince more people that this is the right approach? There is clearly some incredible activity and innovation happening, but not everyone is behind this approach, and change is difficult, right? And convincing people to do things differently is difficult, even if we can see that it might help in the end. So how do we convince people that this work is possible and valuable?
Yeah, I think, the question isn't, in my experience, how do we convince people that innovation is necessary? All over in South Africa, no matter which sphere of government or which local government entity you're looking at, you'll see that plans and strategies refer to innovation. We have whole departments here, whole areas of work dedicated to innovation. So I think more than being an issue of convincing them that we need to do things differently, it's about how do we, one, capacitate public officials with the capabilities to understand and to know what that means and what that looks like. And two is, how do we create spaces in which they can experience, they can feel what it feels like to work in a different way. And so where we've been successful in our work has been to create those spaces. And one project that kind of illustrates this so clearly is the Whole of Society Approach project that was really run by a regional government here, but it was focused on how to work better together in space. And so what it is, we created a fictional mother and daughter character, Carol and Lindy. And the question that really grounded and focused this work was, how does Carol and Lindy need government to work to ensure that they live happy, healthy, successful and fulfilling lives? And, that shift, creating that shift for officials that are always thinking about plans and strategies and kind of complying with their performances, this was a massive shift for them, where now they could actually, it brought them back to the reason why they were public sector officials in the first place. And so what this meant is suddenly, you have a new set of principles guiding your work. And in this case, for them, collaboration was incredibly important. It's like we have all these spheres of government, all these various departments working in space. How do we collaborate to have a better impact on Carol and Lindy? How do we learn? So how do we create spaces where we learn, and failing means failing forward? And then lastly, how do we adapt? So how do we move through this process, understanding that what we're doing, this is a generative, emergent process. And so with those principles kind of, underpinning the work, it became more about figuring out how they needed to structure themselves, including how do we change our relationship with community? How do we change our relationship with each other? And when you look at the results of these, they're not massive projects that we can point to. We can't point to a bridge and say, wow, these guys built a bridge, or wow. But what it did was give this group of officials tools that they spread throughout their work. And so because we had WOZA, we now have a program in government that looks at crime and violence through a lens of healthcare, of public healthcare, rather than a lens of like law enforcement. And so I think that, what we need to do is change people's perspectives about what innovation looks like. It's not always a technological output. It's not always this big, new, beautiful model. Sometimes innovation is, kind of finding new ways to talk to each other, meeting up for coffees, having WhatsApp groups within a particular municipality so you can respond to service delivery challenges more effectively. That's really been the power of the work that we've been involved in.
Ruchka, this is a perfect way for us to end the session. I think that idea of changing perspectives and seeing things from a different angle is just something that's run through all the examples we've heard. In just 45 minutes, we've heard so many different ways that local government are innovating and doing things differently. This is the second time we brought you all together, and hopefully the next time we bring the three of you together, it will be for a real life coffee or a real life kind of conversation. So for today, thank you very much to Ruchka, to Peter, to Noel for joining us from South Africa, from France, from up the road in London. And it's such a pleasure. Really appreciate it. Thanks to Birol as well, who had to leave. And we're really looking forward to the next time we meet again. Thank you for your time. And do tune in for the next session on imagining new and possible futures for cities just after this little interlude. Take care, everyone. And I'll see everyone in 2 minutes.